Speaker, well, I'm pleased to support the amendment proposed by our Labor leader Phil Goff as outlined on the order paper. And I can tell the previous speaker that over the last week since the budget was announced, Labor MPs have been out there talking to a lot of people in the community, and it's fair to say that they're absolutely underwhelmed by this budget. They're underwhelmed and they're deeply concerned. John Key called the increase in GST and the tax package a tax switch, but for middle and low-income earners, it's a tax swindle. Because the truth, Mr Speaker, is that most New Zealanders' tax cuts will be wiped out by the nearly 6% inflation, and most Kiwis won't be compensated for the GST rise that this government has introduced. And the government knows this. It's based on their own numbers, but they're not admitting it. They're not fronting up to the New Zealand public. They need to start to tell the truth about this budget. Now, on the North Shore where I work, and people have this view that it's a very affluent area, I came across a family with two young kids, Mr Speaker, and even after a wage increase is factored in for the next year, they're going to end up $55 a week worse off after GST and ECE cuts. So the tax cuts are not only a tax swindle, but they're unfair. They fail John Key's fairness test, because a third goes to the top 5% and 15% goes to the top 1%. So people in the middle and at the bottom are going backwards under this budget. And of course people on the bottom, people on unemployment benefits and people on minimum wage will get a pay cut. They'll get a pay cut, but of course that's happened before. And in the next year, as inflation goes up to record levels and with it the costs of food, petrol, power, childcare and ACC, we're going to see just how awful this swindle is. Now, Mr Speaker, this is also a budget of broken promises. John Key told New Zealand he would not raise taxes. He was unequivocal about that. He said, quote, "National is not going to be raising GST. National wants to cut taxes, not raise taxes. If National was doing a half-decent job, it wouldn't need to either raise GST or raise taxes," unquote. No, that's true. He's not doing a decent job and he's broken that promise. And the second part of the broken promise is that they're funded by borrow and hope. Debt that's going to amount up for today and tomorrow's families. We're all going to be paying for this for years to come. And there's another broken promise in this budget, which is the promise not to cut public services. Well, there's cuts in this budget, all right, Mr Speaker, $300 million short in health, $400 million out of early childhood education, cuts to housing, cuts to other parts of education, cuts to NGO funding, and of course the gutting of ACC. Now, I want to know who voted for those cuts in the last election, because the National Party was not upfront about those. I met Mr John McGill of Northcote this week, who's in his 80s. He's had his home care cut to half an hour a week, even though he's recently had cataracts removed from his eyes and he's got a shoulder injury that, of course, ACC are refusing to treat because it's age-related. That's another broken promise, and people are being affected by these things right across the country. National said they wouldn't increase taxes, but a particular group of workers will not only have to pay extra GST, but they're going to have their tax increased. And I'm talking about, Mr Speaker, I'm talking about workers who are made redundant through no fault of their own and who are lucky enough to have redundancy compensation in their agreement, unlike the many that National refused to support a couple of weeks ago when they wouldn't agree to minimum redundancy notice and pay. Up until this budget, if a worker gets made redundant from their job, and that's something that happens to tens of thousands of Kiwi workers last year, they get a 6% rebate on the tax on their redundancy payment. That rebate was based on a flat rate of 6 cents in the dollar of up to $60,000 in redundancy. And that means, for example, that if a worker gets paid $20,000 redundancy pay, then he or she is entitled to a flat rate rebate of 6 cents, which comes out at $1,200 rebate. Now, that's being cut in this budget. And the reason that redundancy payments were treated differently is because they were there to compensate for lost earnings until a worker can find a new job. But because redundancy payments can be a large one-off payment, it can push workers into the next, or their annual earnings into a higher tax bracket, and they end up paying more tax than they should. That's unfair, and it's not the intention of income tax. But the National Party is so mean that they're going to raise taxes for redundant workers who get compensation. That is what they're doing, Mr Quinn, and you can make silly noises. You go and talk to some workers in the area you work who've been made redundant. Up until 1992, the tax rate on redundancy was 5%. National Party upped that. And then in 2007, Labor changed the situation so that it was much fairer for workers getting redundancy compensation. Now, of course, National voted against them, listen to them braying, without ever admitting that they just don't believe in fairness for workers. And as I've said, redundancy payments are different. They shouldn't be taxed. The government should not be increasing tax on redundancy payments. It's mean. It's really, really mean. And I want to know exactly why the government's proposed to do this, because it's a shameful and sneaky tax increase. It's a mean little part of the budget, Mr Speaker, but I'm not surprised, because the National Party is not interested in Kiwi workers. They don't care about what happens to them when they lose their jobs. They do not care. Well, that's true. Well, Australia has redundancy compensation and fair tax. Interesting that. Mr Speaker, this is a budget of lost opportunities. The government's tax cuts will make it harder for Kiwis to get ahead, and it fails to deliver on better jobs and better wages. One thing, it did dump the skills strategy. There's nothing in this budget about jobs and skills. Nothing in it. Absolutely nothing to address the wages problem. And we have a wages problem, not a tax problem. Fiddling with the tax system is not going to improve our wages. And even the increases in the job opportunities in the budget, which may I say, Mr Speaker, are just a drop in the bucket. We're talking about 60,000 young people out of work, and we're going to have a few thousand job opportunities. But they've got a little barb with them as well. Up until now, a job opportunities job could not be accepted if the employment agreement attached to the job contained a 90-day employment trial provision. And Paula Bennett and Kate Wilkinson came to this House and said, we are not going to have the 90-day trial provision in job opportunities because they're fixed-term contracts. It's not fair. But now they've changed their mind. And in a move that's completely unfair to the young job seekers, Mr Speaker, they're going to open up the 90-day trial period to job opportunities. It's unbelievable. You know, and let's tell the truth about this scheme. This is a scheme where people get 6 months employment, 6 months temporary employment. I don't know how many of them get permanent jobs. I suspect it's very, very few. And now, under the government's change to job opportunities, they're going to be at risk of having even less than 90 days employment. This is a taxpayer subsidised scheme. The taxpayers subsidise employers for this, and so there should be a high level of scrutiny over the way workers are treated, particularly young workers who are in their first employment opportunity. And so I'm very disappointed with that, and I want to know why the Minister has changed her mind, and I'll certainly be asking her about that. I do suspect, Mr Speaker, that the government is readying itself to open up the 90-day trial period to all workers. I think we'll see that. But this one doesn't make sense. It's completely unfair. The jobs are fixed term. They're 6 months only. It's highly suspect, and I'm deeply worried about the vulnerable young workers that'd be going into this scheme, not knowing what they're getting in, not knowing their rights, getting dumped in less than 90 days while the taxpayer is subsidising the employer. So, Mr Speaker, hard-working Kiwis are going to be worse off on this budget. I say it's a shame.
I call the Honourable Georgina Te Thank
you, Mr Speaker.